Julia never thought she would be crying in front of 40 people who used to be strangers. But there she stood, right in the middle of her grandfather's private library, her hands shaking so hard she had to press them against her chest just to breathe. The room smelled like old leather and fresh coffee, the kind of smell that only exists in a house that has been loved for 50 years. Everyone around her was clapping, every single one of them. And she had no idea why. 3 days earlier, Julia was working a double shift at a diner outside Tulsa, Oklahoma, barely making enough to cover her rent, when she got the call that changed everything. Her grandfather, Walter Hensley, a man she hadn't seen in almost 6 years because of a family feud nobody ever talked about out loud, had passed away in his sleep. The funeral was small, quiet, the kind where people whisper more than they speak. Julia stood in the back, feeling like she didn't belong, feeling like maybe she never really knew the man who used to sneak her butterscotch candy when she was 7 years old. Antes de continuarmos, clique no botão gostei, inscreva-se no canal e deixe comentário dizendo de qual estado você está assistindo. Acredito que esta história chegou até você hoje por motivo. Nobody in that family expected Julia to be invited to the reading of the will. Not her uncles, who had spent years managing Walter's businesses. Not her cousins, who had houses twice the size of anything Julia would ever afford. And certainly not her Aunt Deborah, who made it very clear, with a tight smile and cold eyes, that Julia showing up was nothing more than a courtesy. But the lawyer had called her personally. He said her name 3 times to make sure he had the right number. He said, "Walter left specific instructions, and you need to be there." So there she was, dressed in the only nice blouse she owned, sitting in a leather chair that probably cost more than her car, surrounded by relatives who hadn't sent her a single birthday card in years. The lawyer, a tall man named Mr. Sanders with kind eyes and a folder thick with papers, cleared his throat and the room went completely silent. He looked directly at Julia before he said a single word about the estate, and something about the way he looked at her made her stomach drop straight to the floor. She could feel her aunt's eyes burning into the side of her face. She could hear her uncle shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone in that room was thinking the same thing. Why is she here? Why did he call her specifically? What does Walter know that the rest of us don't? Mr. Sanders opened the folder slowly, and the sound of that paper unfolding felt louder than a gunshot in the silence of the room. He looked up one more time, right at Julia, and said the words that would change the rest of her life forever. "Before I read the will, Walter left a letter. He asked me to read it out loud, to everyone before anything else." Julia's hands were trembling so violently now that she had to sit on them. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure the whole room could hear it. Whatever was written on that page, whatever her grandfather had wanted the world to know before he divided up everything he owned, was about to come out. And judging by the look on Mr. Sanders's face, it was not going to be what anyone in that room was expecting. He unfolded the letter. His eyes scanned the first line, and then he paused, took a slow breath, and said quietly, almost like he couldn't believe it himself, "Walter wrote this 3 weeks before he passed, and it starts with your name, Julia." Mr. Sanders's voice cracked just slightly as he read the first line of the letter out loud. "My dearest Julia, if you are hearing this, it means I ran out of time to tell you everything I wanted to say in person." The room, which had been buzzing with tension only seconds before, fell into a silence so complete that Julia could hear the old grandfather clock ticking somewhere down the hallway. Her Aunt Deborah's mouth was slightly open. Her uncles exchanged glances that Julia couldn't quite read. And Julia herself sat frozen, staring at Mr. Sanders like the words coming out of his mouth belonged to someone else's life, not hers. Walter's letter continued, and with every sentence Julia felt like she was seeing her grandfather for the first time. He wrote about the summer she was 7, when her parents were going through their divorce and nobody had time for a scared little girl who cried herself to sleep every night. He wrote about how he used to drive 2 hours every single Sunday just to sit with her on his porch and let her talk, or not talk, whatever she needed that day. Julia hadn't thought about those Sundays in years. She had buried that memory somewhere deep, somewhere she didn't have to feel the ache of losing it. What none of the family in that room knew, what Julia herself didn't fully understand yet, was that those quiet Sunday visits weren't just a kind old man spending time with his granddaughter. They were the beginning of something Walter had been planning for over a decade, something so carefully hidden that even his own children never suspected a thing. Mr. Sanders paused again, glancing briefly at the family before continuing to read. And something in his hesitation made Julia's chest tighten with a mixture of fear and hope she couldn't explain. The letter went on to describe how Walter had watched Julia grow up from a distance after the family rift tore everyone apart, how he heard through cousins and old friends about her working 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school, how he heard she still sent birthday cards to family members who never once wrote back. "You never stopped being kind," the letter said, "even when kindness cost you everything." Julia pressed her hand over her mouth. She could feel tears sliding down her face, and for the first time since she sat down in that chair, she didn't care who was watching her cry. Her Uncle Richard finally broke the silence, his voice sharp and impatient. "Sanders, what exactly is the point of all this? We're here for the will, not a bedtime story." But Mr. Sanders didn't flinch. He simply looked up, folded the letter halfway, and said something that made the entire room go rigid. "The point, Richard, is that everything I'm about to read next depends entirely on you understanding why." Julia noticed her Aunt Deborah's hands had curled into tight fists in her lap. She noticed how her cousins, who used to tease her mercilessly at family gatherings before the falling out, were now avoiding eye contact completely. Something was shifting in that room, something heavy and unspoken, and Julia had the strangest feeling that the family she had been quietly grieving for years, the family that had shut her out, was about to learn something about themselves that they were not prepared to hear. Mr. Sanders set the letter down gently on the desk and reached for the second folder, the one with the actual legal documents inside. His hand rested on top of it for a moment, almost like he was giving everyone one last chance to brace themselves. "There's one more thing Walter wanted me to say before we go any further," he said, his eyes moving slowly around the room before landing back on Julia. "He said that everyone in this room made a choice 6 years ago, and he said only one person made the right one." The words hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Only one person made the right one. Julia felt every eye in the room shift toward her, and for the first time since she walked through the door of her grandfather's house, she understood that whatever was coming next was going to break this family wide open. Mr. Sanders reached into the folder and pulled out a second document, this one thicker than the first, bound with a simple black clip that looked like it had been handled 100 times before Walter ever signed it. "6 years ago, Mr. Sanders began, there was an incident at Walter's 75th birthday dinner. Some of you remember it as an argument over money. Walter remembered it differently." Julia's stomach twisted. She remembered that night too, though she had spent years trying not to. It was the night her father and her Uncle Richard had gotten into a screaming match over Walter's business, accusing each other of trying to control the old man's finances while he was still breathing. Julia, only 22 at the time, had tried to calm everyone down, and in return, she had been told by her own Aunt Deborah to stay out of grown folks' business in front of the entire family. What nobody in that room knew, what even Julia had forgotten in the years since, was that Walter had been standing in the doorway that whole time, watching silently as his family tore itself apart over money he hadn't even died yet to leave behind. He never said a word about it that night. He simply walked back to his study, sat down, and began writing. Mr. Sanders held up a folded page, yellowed slightly at the edges, dated the very next morning after that fight. "This is the first version of the letter Walter wrote about tonight," he said. "He was already planning this 6 years ago." Uncle Richard's face had gone pale. Aunt Deborah's composure, the tight, controlled smile she had worn since Julia walked into the room, had completely disappeared. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice shaking now instead of commanding. "He can't hold one bad night against us for 6 years." But Mr. Sanders simply continued, his voice calm and steady, even as the room around him grew louder with murmurs and disbelief. "He didn't hold it against you because of the argument," he said. "He held it against you because of what happened after. Because while all of you were fighting over what you thought you'd inherit, Julia was the only one who called him every single week for the rest of his life, never once asking him for anything. Julia hadn't realized anyone knew about those calls. She had never mentioned them to a single soul, not even her closest friends. Every Sunday night, without fail, she called her grandfather just to check in, just to hear his voice long after the rest of the family had stopped speaking to him regularly. She never asked about money. She never asked about the business. She just asked how his knee was healing, whether he was eating enough vegetables, whether he'd finished the mystery novel he was reading. She had no idea he had been keeping track. She had no idea it mattered to anyone but the two of them. The room was unraveling now. Her cousin Ashley stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped over, demanding to know why nobody had told them about a second letter, about calls, about any of it. Uncle Richard was pacing near the bookshelves, running his hands through his hair, muttering about lawyers and contesting wills. Aunt Deborah had gone completely silent, staring at the floor like she was trying to remember every conversation she'd ever had about Julia behind her back, wondering how much of it Walter had somehow heard about. Julia sat perfectly still in the middle of the chaos, tears streaming freely down her face now, not from sadness anymore, but from something closer to shock. Mr. Sanders raised his hand, and slowly, reluctantly, the room quieted again. "There's more," he said. And something about the way he said it made Julia's chest tighten painfully. Walter didn't just leave a letter explaining his reasoning. He restructured the entire estate 18 months ago. Every property, every account, every business holding, everything was moved into a new trust. And there is only one name on that trust as the sole beneficiary. Julia felt like the floor had disappeared beneath her chair. She wanted to speak, wanted to say this had to be some kind of mistake, that surely her grandfather hadn't done what she was beginning to suspect he had done. Not to his own children. Not to the family that had raised him up in this very house for decades. But before she could get a single word out, Mr. Sanders opened the final page of the trust documents, glanced once more at the stunned, furious, heartbroken faces surrounding him, and said the words that stopped every heart in that room at once. "Julia, everything Walter owned now belongs to you, all of it, and there's a condition attached that none of you are going to like." For a moment, nobody in the room made a single sound. Then it all broke loose at once. Uncle Richard slammed his hand against the bookshelf so hard that a framed photograph rattled and nearly fell. Aunt Deborah was on her feet, her voice rising into something close to a scream, demanding that Mr. Sanders explain himself, demanding to know how a man could disinherit his own children for a girl who had barely spoken to the family in years. Cousin Ashley was crying now too, though her tears looked more like fury than grief. Julia sat frozen in the center of it all, feeling like she had been dropped into a stranger's nightmare. "There's a condition," Mr. Sanders repeated, louder this time, forcing the room back into silence. "Julia does not automatically receive control of the estate. Walter's trust states that everything remains frozen for 90 days. During that time, Julia must live in this house, manage the daily affairs of the estate, and meet with every single family member individually." Walter's exact words were, "She has to decide, with full knowledge of everyone's true colors, whether this family deserves a second chance." The room went cold. Julia realized with a jolt that hit her straight in the chest that her grandfather hadn't just left her his fortune. He had left her the impossible task of judging the very people who had judged her for years. Aunt Deborah turned on Julia with a look of pure venom, the kindness she had performed just hours earlier completely gone. "You planned this," she hissed. "You've been manipulating him for years, calling him every Sunday, playing the poor sympathetic granddaughter, and this is your payoff." The accusation landed like a slap. Julia opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came out. How could she explain that she had called her grandfather out of love, not strategy, when the proof standing in front of everyone looked exactly like the outcome of a very long con? Julia stood up on shaking legs, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "I didn't know anything about this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper at first, then growing stronger with every word. "I called him because I missed him. Because he was the only person in this family who ever made me feel like I mattered. I never once asked him for a dime, and I'm not going to stand here and apologize for loving my grandfather." Something shifted in the room as she spoke. Not everyone softened. Aunt Deborah's face remained hard as stone, and Richard was still pacing like a caged animal. But Ashley, red-eyed and trembling, was staring at Julia differently now, like she was seeing her cousin clearly for the first time in years. Then the door to the study creaked open and everyone turned. Standing there was Walter's longtime housekeeper, Miss Odessa, a woman who had worked in that house for over 30 years and who nobody in the family had thought to invite into the reading of the will. She was holding a small wooden box in her weathered hands, and her eyes were fixed directly on Julia. "Mr. Walter asked me to bring this in at exactly this moment," she said quietly. "He said I'd know when." The room, already reeling from shock after shock, braced itself for whatever was inside that box. Miss Odessa crossed the room slowly and placed the box in Julia's trembling hands. Inside, wrapped in a soft cloth, was an old photograph of Julia at 7 years old, sitting on Walter's porch, laughing so hard her eyes were squeezed shut, and beneath the photograph, a single folded note in Walter's unmistakable handwriting. Julia unfolded it with fingers that could barely hold steady, and as she read the words silently to herself, her breath caught in her throat so violently that the entire room fell into stunned silence, waiting to find out what could possibly come next. She looked up, tears blurring her vision, and said the words out loud for everyone to hear. He knew Aunt Deborah would say I manipulated him. He wrote it down. He said, "Tell them the money was never the point. And it still isn't. Tell them I forgive them, and I hope Julia can find it in her heart to do the same." The room that had been filled with rage and accusations only moments earlier suddenly felt heavy with something else entirely, something none of them had expected to feel that day. Shame. And underneath it, buried deep, the faint and fragile beginning of something that almost looked like hope. 90 days passed slower than Julia ever thought possible, and faster than she ever wanted them to. She moved into her grandfather's house that same week, sleeping in the small guest room down the hall from the study where her whole life had changed. Every morning she woke up to the smell of coffee that Miss Odessa still made out of habit. 2 cups instead of 1, like Walter might walk down the stairs any minute asking for his newspaper. Julia kept that tradition going without ever being asked to. It felt like the least she could do for a man who had quietly loved her louder than anyone else in her family ever had. She met with each relative just like the trust required. Some meetings were short and cold. Uncle Richard barely looked at her across the kitchen table, still convinced somewhere deep down that he'd been cheated out of something he was owed. But others surprised her. Cousin Ashley showed up one rainy Tuesday afternoon, soaked from the walk up the driveway, and instead of anger, she brought an old shoebox full of photographs neither of them had seen in years, pictures of family barbecues and birthday parties from before everything fell apart. They sat on the porch for 3 hours that day, and for the first time in 6 years, Julia heard her cousin laugh. Aunt Deborah was the hardest. She came to the house only once during those 90 days, standing stiffly in the doorway of the study like she couldn't bring herself to sit down. She didn't apologize, not exactly, but she asked Julia one question that had clearly been eating at her for weeks. "Why didn't you ever tell any of us he was sick?" Julia looked at her aunt for a long moment before answering softly. "Because he asked me not to. He didn't want pity. He just wanted someone to talk to like nothing was wrong." Something in Deborah's face cracked open right there in that doorway, and for the first time, Julia saw not a bitter woman defending old grudges, but someone who had spent 6 years mourning a relationship she didn't know how to fix. On the 90th day, the whole family gathered back in the study, the same room where everything had exploded 3 months earlier. Mr. Sanders stood at the same desk, holding the same kind of folder, but the air in the room felt completely different this time. Julia stood at the front, her hands steady now instead of shaking, and she looked out at the faces of the people who had once made her feel invisible. She had spent 90 days deciding what her grandfather had asked her to decide, and she had made her choice. "I'm not keeping it," she said simply, and the room drew in a collective breath. Not all of it, anyway. Grandpa Walter didn't leave me this house and this money because he wanted me to punish anyone. He left it to me because he trusted me to do what he always did, which was choose love over pride. She reached for the folder Mr. Sanders had prepared at her request over the last 2 weeks, a new agreement that restructured the trust into something Walter never could have written himself, but something Julia knew deep in her bones he would have wanted. A shared inheritance, split fairly among every single person in that room, with one condition of her own attached. Family dinner, every single Sunday. No exceptions. The way it used to be before money ever got in the way. Aunt Deborah was the first to cry, and it wasn't the sharp defensive tears from 90 days earlier. It was something softer, something that looked almost like relief. Richard walked across the room and hugged Julia for the first time since she was a teenager, mumbling an apology into her shoulder that he probably would have never managed to say out loud any other way. Ashley squeezed her hand so tight it almost hurt, whispering thank you over and over like the words themselves could rebuild 6 lost years in a single afternoon. That evening, as the last of the family finally left, and the house grew quiet again, Julia walked out onto the porch where she used to sit with her grandfather every Sunday as a little girl. The sun was setting gold and orange over the fields behind the house, and the old rocking chair beside her creaked gently in the breeze, empty, but somehow not lonely. She pulled out the small photograph Miss Odessa had given her weeks earlier, the one of a 7-year-old girl laughing so hard her eyes disappeared, and she smiled through fresh tears, the good kind this time. Somewhere out there, Julia liked to believe, Walter was rocking in that same chair beside her, finally at peace, watching the family he loved find their way back to each other, exactly the way he always knew, deep down, that they eventually would.